Queen Valthara had ruled the Kairsani Empire for 300 years, and in all that time she had never once shown weakness or mercy to anyone who disappointed her. Her species was ancient and proud and beautiful in a way that made other races feel small and insignificant when they stood before them. The Kairsani were tall, elegant beings with scales that shimmered like precious gems and markings on their skin that glowed with soft light in the darkness. They had conquered half the galaxy, not through war, but through patience and cunning, and the simple fact that they lived for thousands of years while other species burned bright and faded fast. But for all their power and all their beauty, the Kairsani were slaves to one simple belief that had shaped their entire civilization since the beginning of their recorded history. Fertility was everything. The ability to produce strong, healthy clutches of eggs determined everything in Kairsani society, from social status to political power to basic worth. As a living being, a female who could produce many offspring was celebrated and honored and given the finest things in life. A female who could not produce offspring was considered broken and shameful, and better off dead than alive to embarrass her family. This was the world that Princess Irael had been born into, and this was the world that had declared her worthless before she had even reached adulthood. The royal physicians had examined her when she came of age, as they did with all females of noble blood, and their diagnosis had been delivered to the queen with trembling voices and downcast eyes. The princess was barren. Her egg chambers were malformed and twisted in ways that could not be repaired by any medical technology known to their species. She would never produce offspring, and she would never continue the royal bloodline, and she would never be anything more than a living reminder of imperfection in a family that demanded perfection. Above all else, Queen Valthara had received this news in silence, and her advisors had watched her face for any sign of emotion, but there was nothing. No grief for her daughter, and no anger at the unfairness of fate, and no determination to find another way. There was only cold calculation, as the queen considered how to dispose of this problem without damaging her own reputation. The solution she chose was simple and cruel in the way that only someone who had never known love could devise. She ordered her daughter locked away in the eastern spire of the palace, where no one would see her, and no one would speak of her, and no one would remember that she existed. Zirael was 17 years old when the door closed behind her, and she did not see the sun again for nearly a decade. The spire was beautiful in the way that a cage made of gold and jewels is still a cage, no matter how much it sparkles. Zirael had servants who brought her food and cleaned her chambers and attended to her physical needs, but they were forbidden from speaking to her beyond what was absolutely necessary. She had windows that looked out over the city below, but they were made of one-way glass, so she could see the world while the world could not see her. She had everything a princess could want except freedom and love and hope and purpose. In those long, lonely years, Zirael found only one comfort, and it came from the most unexpected source: a young servant girl named Thikal who cleaned. The spire took pity on the forgotten princess and began smuggling in books and recordings from the palace library. At first, Zirael read stories from her own people, but they only made her feel worse because every tale celebrated mothers and fertility and the joy of producing offspring. Then Thikal brought her something different. She brought her human literature. The humans were a young species that the Kairsani had only recently encountered, and most of her people considered them primitive and unimportant and barely worth noticing. But their stories were unlike anything Zirael had ever experienced. She read tales of heroes who were valued for their courage and kindness. Rather than their ability to reproduce, she read stories of love that had nothing to do with producing children and everything to do with two souls finding each other in a vast and lonely universe. She read about humans who had been told they were worthless and broken and useless, who had risen up and proven everyone wrong through sheer determination and refusal to accept the limits others placed upon them. For the first time in her life, Zero began to imagine that maybe she was not the problem. Maybe the problem was a society that measured worth by something as random and uncontrollable as fertility. Maybe there was another way to live. But imagination and reality are different things, and Zyrel remained in her tower while the years passed and her hope slowly faded like light dying at the end of a long day. Then everything changed. The Galactic Concordat was a loose alliance of spacefaring species that had formed to promote trade and prevent wars and generally keep the galaxy from descending into chaos. They had been pressuring the Gaiarsani Empire to form closer ties with humanity, and the humans had been pushing for some kind of formal alliance that would give them access to Gaiarsani Jumpgate. Technology Queen Velthara had resisted for years because she considered humans beneath her attention, but the political pressure had finally become too great to ignore. The Concordat suggested a marriage alliance, as was traditional among many species when forming bonds between civilizations. The humans would send a representative of high status to marry a member of the Gaiarsani royal family, and the two species would be bound together by something stronger than any treaty. When Velthara heard this proposal, something shifted in her ancient calculating mind. She saw an opportunity, not an opportunity for peace or alliance or mutual benefit, but an opportunity to finally rid herself of her greatest shame while appearing generous and diplomatic. She would give the humans her barren daughter. She would dress Zyrel in the finest clothes and present her as a treasure beyond measure, and the primitive humans would never know the difference. By the time they discovered that their princess could not produce offspring, the marriage would be complete, and the treaty would be signed, and any complaint would make the humans look foolish rather than wronged. It was perfect, Queen. Velthara summoned her advisors and gave them their orders with a smile that never reached her eyes. Bring the defective one from the tower and make her presentable, she commanded in a voice that allowed no argument or question. We have found a use for her at last in the Eastern Spire. Zyrel heard the locks on her door opening for the first time in years, and she did not know whether to feel hope or terror. She would soon learn that she should have felt both. Commander Marcus Chun had spent 20 years fighting in the worst conflicts humanity had ever known, and he had never once complained about his assignments. He had led troops through the frozen hell of the Titan Uprising and the burning chaos of the Mars Rebellion and the silent terror of the Outer Rim pirate wars. He had watched friends die in his arms and killed enemies who were trying to kill him, and done all the terrible things that soldiers must do when civilization sends them to protect its borders. Through all of it, he had remained steady and reliable, and willing to do whatever his species needed from him. But this was different. This was politics, and Marcus hated politics more than he had ever hated any enemy he had faced. In battle, the United Earth government had selected him to be the ceremonial husband of an alien princess, and no amount of arguing or protesting or threatening to resign had changed their decision. Earth needed Gaiarsani Jumpgate technology because it would cut travel times across the galaxy from months to days and open up thousands of new worlds for human expansion. The Gaiarsani needed human adaptability and creativity because their own colony worlds were failing, and they could not figure out why a marriage alliance would bind the two species together, and everyone would benefit, except possibly Marcus, who had never wanted to get married to anyone, let alone an alien he had never met. But duty was duty, and Marcus had never run from his duty no matter how much he wanted to. So he put on his dress uniform and boarded the diplomatic ship and traveled to Gaiarsani, primed to meet his bride. The throne room of the Gaiarsani Palace was the most impressive space Marcus had ever seen, and he had seen some impressive spaces in his years of service. The ceiling rose so high that clouds actually formed near the top, and gentle rain fell in certain sections, while artificial sunlight streamed through crystal windows. The walls were covered in living plants that glowed with soft bioluminescence and filled the air with sweet alien scents. Thousands of Gaiarsani Courtiers lined the walkway to the throne, their scales shimmering in colors that human eyes could barely process, and their expressions ranging from curiosity to barely concealed contempt. At the far end of the room, Queen Velthara sat on a throne carved from a single massive gemstone that pulsed with inner light like a beating heart. She was beautiful in the way that a glacier is beautiful, which is to say cold and ancient and completely indifferent to the small warm things that might freeze in her presence. Marcus walked toward her with his head held high and his shoulders back and his face carefully blank, because he had learned long ago that showing emotion to hostile observers was a weakness that would be exploited. Reached the base of the throne and bowed exactly as deep as protocol required, and not a centimeter deeper. "Your Majesty," he said in a voice that carried across the silent chamber. "I am Commander Marcus Chun of the United Earth Government, and I have come to honor the alliance between our peoples." The Queen looked down at him with eyes that had seen civilizations rise and fall, and she smiled in a way that made Marcus immediately suspicious. "Welcome, human," she replied in perfectly accented English, because the Kairsani considered it beneath them to use translation devices. "We are pleased that your people have sent such a distinguished representative to receive our gift." She gestured toward a side entrance, and the crowd parted to reveal a veiled figure descending a long staircase toward the main floor. Marcus watched carefully as his bride approached, and something immediately struck him as wrong. The Kairsani courtiers he had observed moved with absolute confidence and grace, as if they owned every space they entered and expected everyone else to get out of their way. This figure moved differently. She walked with small, hesitant steps, as if she expected the floor to collapse beneath her at any moment. Her shoulders were hunched slightly forward in a posture that suggested she was trying to make herself smaller and less noticeable. Her hands trembled beneath the ceremonial veil that covered her completely from head to toe. This was not how a princess walked. This was how a prisoner walked when being led to execution. Marcus looked back at Queen Velthara and saw the barely concealed sneer on her face as she watched her daughter approach, and suddenly he understood that something very wrong was happening here. He did not know what the trick was, but he knew there was a trick, and he knew that this young woman walking toward him was somehow the victim of it. In that moment, Marcus made a decision that would change the course of galactic history. Though he did not know it at the time, he decided that whatever game the Queen was playing, he was going to break the rules. "Your Majesty," he said loudly enough for the entire court to hear. "I would see my bride's face before the ceremony begins." A gasp ran through the assembled courtiers. Like a wave crashing on a shore, Kirazani tradition demanded that the bride remain veiled until the bonding ritual was complete, and for a human to demand otherwise was an insult to centuries of sacred custom. "That is not our way," Queen Velthara said, and her voice had lost some of its false warmth. "It is our way," Marcus replied without backing down. "Humans marry face to face and heart to heart, or we do not marry at all." He paused and looked directly at the Queen with eyes that had stared down pirates and rebels and things far more dangerous than an alien monarch. "Unless there is some reason you do not wish me to see her face." The silence stretched for a long moment, and Marcus could feel the tension building, like pressure before a storm. Then slowly, and without waiting for her mother's permission, the veiled figure reached up and lifted the covering from her face. She was beautiful in a way that was alien but not unpleasant, with large violet eyes and delicate features and scales that shimmered like moonlight on water. But what struck Marcus was not her beauty. What struck him was her eyes. He had seen those eyes before, in the faces of soldiers who had lost everything, and in the faces of refugees who had fled destroyed homes, and in the faces of prisoners who had given up any hope of rescue. They were the eyes of someone who had accepted that they were already dead and was just waiting for the universe to make it official. Marcus ignored the Pastes court and ignored the Queen and ignored every piece of diplomatic protocol he had ever learned. He walked forward until he was standing directly in front of the young woman, and he spoke to her in a voice soft enough that only she could hear. "Hello," he said. "I am Marcus, and I would like to know your name." She stared at him as if he had spoken in a language she did not understand. "My name is Zyrel," she whispered after a moment that seemed to stretch forever. "Zyrel," he repeated carefully, letting the syllables settle on his tongue. "That is a beautiful name." He smiled at her, and it was a real smile, not the fake diplomatic expression he had worn since arriving. "Tell me, Zyrel," he said, "would you like to get married today, or would you prefer that we spend some time getting to know each other first?" Behind them, Queen Valtharis' claws scraped against the armrest of her throne, hard enough to leave marks in the ancient stone. She had expected the human to be a fool, and perhaps he was, but he was not the kind of fool she had anticipated. For the first time in centuries, the Queen felt something she had almost forgotten how to feel. She felt uncertain. 3 months had passed since the wedding, and Zyrel still could not believe that any of it was real. She kept waiting for Marcus to reveal his true nature and show her the cruelty that surely lurked beneath his kind words and gentle smiles. She kept expecting him to grow tired of her and cast her aside like the broken, worthless thing her mother had always told her she was. But day after day, he continued to surprise her in ways she could not have imagined. He asked her opinion on things, as if her thoughts actually mattered. He listened when she spoke, as if her words were worth hearing. He made her laugh, which was something she had almost forgotten how to do after years alone in her tower prison, and he never once touched her without her permission or made her feel like she owed him anything for the kindness he showed her. They lived in the human embassy on Kairsani, prime in quarters that Marcus had insisted on redesigning himself. He had torn out the cold, sterile furniture that the Kairsani considered appropriate and replaced it with soft, warm things that invited you to sit down and relax. He had filled the walls with paintings and photographs and art from a dozen different human cultures, because he said that beauty should surround you, not intimidate you. Most importantly, he had built a garden. It was a small green space in the center of their quarters, filled with plants from Earth that should not have been able to survive on an alien world. But Marcus had studied the soil and the light in the atmosphere, and he had found ways to make them thrive. He said it was simple science, but Zyrel thought it was something more like magic. The garden became her favorite place in all the universe, and she spent hours there every day reading and thinking, and slowly learning to breathe without fear. That was where she finally told him the truth. They sat together on a bench surrounded by strange flowers that smelled like nothing she had ever experienced. And Zyrel felt the weight of her secret pressing down on her until she could not carry it any longer. "There is something I must tell you," she said, and her voice trembled with the effort of forcing out words she had spent months trying to avoid. Marcus looked at her with patient eyes and waited without pushing or demanding. "I cannot give you children," she said, and the words came out in a rush like water bursting through a dam. "I am barren and defective, and my egg chambers are malformed in ways that cannot be repaired." She could not look at him, so she stared at the flowers instead. "My mother sent me to you as an insult," she continued. "She expected you to discover my flaw and reject me in disgust and dissolve the marriage in shame so that the treaty would be broken and humanity would be humiliated." The silence that followed was the longest of her life. Then Marcus laughed. Zyrel flinched as if he had struck her, because laughter was what she had feared most of all. Laughter meant mockery, and mockery meant cruelty, and cruelty meant that all the kindness had been an illusion after all. But when she finally forced herself to look at him, his eyes were warm and his smile was gentle, and there was no cruelty in his expression at all. "I am not laughing at you," he said, quickly reaching for her hand in that strange human gesture of comfort that she had learned to accept. "I am laughing at your mother." He shook his head in a way that humans did when they found something ridiculous. "She thought she was punishing me," he said with genuine amusement in his voice. "She thought giving me you was some kind of insult or curse." He squeezed her hand gently. Z-Rail. I have spent 20 years watching good people die in wars that were started because someone wanted resources they could have simply asked to share. His voice grew serious, but not unkind. I have seen what happens when societies treat people as nothing more than breeding stock or bodies to throw at enemies in battle. He turned to face her fully. I have seen the Kairsani system and how it treats females who cannot produce offspring, and I have to tell you, it disgusts me more than anything I encountered in all my years of war. Zero did not know what to say, so she said nothing. You think I care about fertility? Marcus continued. You think that is what I value in a partner? He laughed again, but it was a softer sound this time. There are 8 billion humans on Earth alone, he said. We have plenty of children, and we will have plenty more without any help from you or me. He reached up and gently turned her face toward him so that she had to look into his eyes. What we do not have enough of is kindness. He said, we do not have enough courage or hope or the willingness to keep going when everything seems impossible. His thumb brushed away a tear that Zyrel had not realized was falling down her cheek. You have all of those things in abundance, he said. You have survived things that would have broken most people, and you have done it without becoming cruel or bitter or hateful. How can you know that? Zyrel whispered. You have only known me for 3 months. I know it because you are still here. Marcus replied, I know it because despite everything your people told you about your worth, you kept going and kept hoping and kept reading those human stories that showed you another way to live. He smiled at her. I know it because when you came down those stairs at our wedding and lifted your veil, you looked at me with fear, but you also looked at me with something else. What? She asked. Curiosity, he said. You were afraid of what I might be, but you were also curious about what I might be instead. He leaned forward slightly. That makes you braver than any soldier I have ever commanded, and stronger than any warrior I have ever fought beside. I do not feel brave. Zyrel said. The brave ones never do, Marcus replied. That is how you know it is real courage, and not just foolishness. He stood up and offered her his hand. Come with me, he said. I want to show you something. She took his hand and let him lead her to a part of the garden she had not explored before. Hidden behind a wall of climbing vines was a small alcove with a single bench and a view of the alien sky above. I built this for you, Marcus said. A place where you can come whenever you need to remember that you are not what they told you that you were. Zyrel looked at the small perfect space and felt something shift inside her heart. Why? She asked. Why do you do these things for me? Marcus considered the question for a moment before answering. Because everyone deserves to have someone who sees them for who they really are, he said. And because you are worth seeing. That night Zyrel slept without nightmares for the first time since she was a child. And somewhere deep inside her the seed of something new began to grow. It would take time to flower, but it would change everything when it did. 2 years had passed since the wedding and Queen Valthara had heard rumors that disturbed her greatly at first she had dismissed them as exaggerations or lies spread by her enemies at court, but the reports kept coming from too many different sources to ignore, and they all said the same impossible thing. Her barren daughter was thriving. The spies Valthara had placed in the human embassy reported that. Zyrel laughed now and smiled, and walked through the corridors like someone who had every right to be there. They reported that she had learned to speak 3 human languages and had begun teaching Kairsani to human diplomats who wanted to understand her people better. They reported that she and her human husband had started a school in the outer colonies, where Kairsani females were taught that their worth was not determined by their ability to produce eggs. This last rumor was the one that bothered the queen most of all. She had sent her defective daughter away to be humiliated and forgotten, and instead the girl had become a symbol of something Dangerous she had become, hopeful Thora summoned Zerael and Marcus back to the palace under the pretense of renewing the treaty between their species. But the real reason was simpler and darker. She wanted to see for herself what her daughter had become, and she wanted to remind Zerael of her place in the natural order of things. The day of the audience arrived, and the throne room filled with courtiers who had heard whispers about the changed princess. They came expecting entertainment of one kind or another, whether that meant watching Velthara destroy her daughter or watching Zerael somehow stand against the most powerful being in the Empire. What they got was something none of them had anticipated. The doors at the far end of the chamber opened, and Marcus Chun walked in wearing the formal uniform of a human admiral, because Earth had promoted him several times. Since the marriage, he moved with the confidence of a man who had faced death many times and no longer feared it, but the courtiers barely noticed him because walking beside him was someone they did not recognize. Isire had changed, the hunched, frightened creature who had descended those stairs 2 years ago was gone completely. In her place was a woman who stood tall with her shoulders back and her head held high. She wore clothing that blended human and Kayasani styles in a way that was entirely new and entirely her own. The ceremonial robes that marked fertility status were nowhere to be seen because she had chosen not to wear them. Scales, which had been dull and faded from years of neglect and depression, now gleamed with health and vitality. Her bioluminescent markings, which had barely glowed at her wedding, now blazed with brilliant light as if a fire had been lit inside her. But the biggest change was in her eyes. The dead, hopeless look was gone, replaced by something that made the courtiers shift uncomfortably where they stood. She looked like someone who knew exactly who she was and exactly what she was worth, and did not care even slightly what anyone else thought about it. Queen Velthara saw her daughter walking toward her, and for the first time in centuries, she paused. She actually paused. An ancient queen who had faced down rebellions and assassinations and threats from 100 different enemies found herself momentarily frozen by the sight of the daughter she had thrown away. This was not supposed to happen. Zerael was supposed to be broken and ashamed and desperate to return to her mother's good grace. Instead, she walked through the throne room like she owned it. The courtiers whispered behind their claws as the couple approached, and Zerael heard every word they said about her. They called her barren and defective and shameful, just as they always had. But this time, she did not flinch or look away or try to make herself smaller. She met their eyes one by one and held their gaze until they were the ones who looked away first. One noble near the front of the crowd decided to test this new confidence with a cutting remark delivered loud enough for everyone to hear. How wonderful that the defective princess has found a human willing to tolerate her condition, she said with venom dripping from every word. Zerael stopped and turned to face the woman who had spoken. Yes, I cannot have children, she replied in a voice that carried across the silent chamber. It leaves me so much more time to improve myself and accomplish things of actual value. She smiled, and there was no fear in it at all. What is your excuse for accomplishing nothing with your life? The court gasped as one being, because no one had ever spoken to a noble that way, especially not a barren female who should have been grateful just to be allowed in the room. The noble sputtered in outrage, but could not find words to respond. Zerael turned away from her as if she had already forgotten the woman existed, and continued walking toward the throne. Queen Velthar watched her approach with an expression that shifted between fury and something that might have been fear. When Zerael and Marcus finally stood before the throne, the queen spoke in a voice like ice cracking. What have you done to my daughter, human? Marcus looked at her with calm, steady eyes that showed no trace of intimidation. I loved her, he said simply, as if it was the most obvious thing in the world. That is all I did. That is everything, Zerael added before her mother could respond. That is everything, and it is something you never did, and never will. She took a step forward, and for the first time in her life, she addressed her mother as an equal, rather than a supplicant. I spent years in that tower, waiting for you to remember that I existed, she said. I spent years hoping that you would love me despite my flaws the way a mother is supposed to love a child. Her voice was steady and strong. I have stopped waiting, and I have stopped hoping because I do not need your love anymore. She gestured at Marcus without looking away from her mother. I found someone who sees my worth, not my womb, and that is more than you have ever had or ever will have. Queen Beltharis' claws dug into the arms of her throne, hard enough to crack the ancient gemstone. You forget yourself, daughter, she hissed. You forget what you are and what you will always be. No, Zyrael replied. For the first time in my life, I remember exactly what I am. She smiled at her mother, and there was pity in it, which was somehow worse than any insult could have been. I am someone who survived you, she said, and I am someone who will spend the rest of my life making sure that no one else has to suffer the way I suffered. She turned her back on the queen of the Kaisani Empire and walked out of the throne room with her human husband at her side. The courtiers parted before her like water flowing around. A stone and Queen Belthara sat on her throne and watched her daughter go and felt something she had not felt in 300 years of absolute rule. She felt powerless. The changes did not happen overnight because real change never does. It started small with whispers in the outer colonies where Kaisani females who had been told they were worthless began to ask questions they had never dared to ask before. Why? Should fertility determine worth? Why should the ability to produce eggs matter more than the ability to think or create or lead or love? Why should half the population live in fear of a biological lottery they could not control? These questions spread like seeds carried on the wind, taking root in minds that had been prepared for them by years of quiet suffering. The schools that Zyrael and Marcus had established became something more than places of learning. They became sanctuaries where females who had been cast out by their families could find shelter and community and purpose. They became symbols of a different way of living that did not depend on ancient traditions that had caused so much pain. Within 5 years, the first protests began in the capital city of Kaisani. Prime females, both fertile and barren, marched through the streets demanding that the laws be changed and that worth be measured by deeds rather than reproductive capacity. The old guard tried to suppress them with force, but for every protester, they arrested 2 more took her place. Within 10 years, the empire had split in 2. The traditionalists clung to the old ways with desperate fury, insisting that fertility was sacred and that changing the ancient customs would destroy their civilization. The reformists rallied around a simple idea that had come from humanity, but had been planted and nurtured by a barren princess who had refused to accept that she was worthless. The idea was this: every person has value simply because they exist, and that value cannot be taken away by biology or circumstance or the cruel judgment of those who claim to be superior. Queen Belthara watched her empire crumble from her throne, and she blamed her daughter for all of it. She gave speeches denouncing Zyrael as a traitor and a corrupting influence who had been seduced by human weakness into betraying her own kind. She ordered the destruction of the schools and the arrest of anyone who spoke in favor of reform. But it was too late. The seed had been planted, and it had grown too strong to be pulled up by the roots. Belthara died 50 years after that confrontation in the throne room, still clutching her beliefs and still refusing to acknowledge that she had been wrong. She did not ask to see her daughter at the end. She did not ask for forgiveness or offer any final words of reconciliation. She simply closed her eyes and stopped breathing, and the universe continued on without her. Zyrael attended the funeral because Marcus convinced her it was the right thing to do. She did not go to seek her mother's approval because that need had died long ago. She did not go to gloat over the death of her tormentor because she had learned that Revenge was a poison that hurt the one who drank it most of all. She went because somewhere, beneath all the cruelty and pride, there had been a person who had been shaped by the same toxic culture that had shaped Zyrael, a person who might have been different in a different world. She stood at the edge of the ceremony and watched them lay her mother to rest. And she felt not triumph, but sadness. Sadness for what could have been and never was. Sadness for the relationship they might have had if things had been different. Sadness for all the years they had lost to hatred and fear and the desperate need to meet standards that should never have existed in the first place. Marcus stood beside her and held her hand and said nothing. Because sometimes silence is the greatest comfort. After the funeral, they returned to their home on a small green world that humans and Kirsani had colonized together. Their house was surrounded by gardens that Marcus had designed and Zyrael had helped to plant. Those gardens were full of children, not biological children because Zyrael could never produce those, but children all the same. Over the years, they had adopted 17 young beings from 12 different species, orphans and refugees and cast-offs who had been told by their own societies that they were unwanted and unworthy. Zyrael and Marcus had taken them in and given them what every child deserves, a home and a family, and the knowledge that they were loved not for what they could produce, but simply for who they were. On the day they returned from the funeral, Zyrael sat in her favorite spot in the garden and watched the children play. Marcus brought her a cup of tea, which was a human tradition she had grown to love, and sat down beside her. His hair was gray now, and his face was lined with age, because humans live such short lives compared to the Kirsani. But his eyes were the same warm, steady eyes that had looked at her in that throne room so many decades ago. Any regrets? He asked, as he did every year on the anniversary of their wedding. Only one. She replied, as she always did, that I did not find you sooner. He smiled and took her hand, and they sat together watching the sunset paint the sky in colors that neither of their species had words for. In the archives of 100 worlds, the story of what happened was recorded in different ways. Historians wrote about political movements and social upheaval and the changing balance of power between species. Sociologists analyzed the factors that had led to the transformation of Kirsani society and debated which elements had been most important. Philosophers argued about the nature of worth and whether the new understanding was truly better than the old. But all of them missed the simple truth at the heart of it all. A queen had thrown away her daughter because she could not see past her own narrow definition of value. A human had picked that daughter up and shown her a different way to measure worth, and the galaxy had never been the same. The Kirsani were not the only species to change because of what had happened. Across the stars, other civilizations watched and learned and began to question their own assumptions about value and worth and what it meant to be a person. Humanity spread through the galaxy, not through conquest or colonization, but through something far more powerful. They spread through example. They showed other species what it looked like when you measured worth by kindness rather than productivity. They showed them what it looked like when you valued potential rather than pedigree. They showed them what it looked like when you looked at someone the universe had declared worthless and said, "No, I see. You and you matter." That was humanity's gift to the stars, not technology or military might or economic power, just the simple, radical, revolutionary idea that every person has value. And it all started with a barren princess and a soldier who refused to treat her the way everyone expected. 50 years after her wedding, Zyrael looked at her husband and her children and her garden full of impossible, thriving things, and she understood at last what Marcus had tried to tell her all those years ago. She had never been broken. She had never been defective. She had never been worthless. She had simply been waiting for someone to see her clearly. And now she spent every day of her life making sure that others did not have to wait as long as she had. That was her legacy. That was their legacy, and it would echo through the stars long after both of them were gone. Because some gifts once given can never be taken back, and love is the greatest gift of all.